Who could take a sunrise, sprinkle it with dew? No, it's not that, Candyman. We're talking of the 1992 original version by Bernard Rose, based on the Clive Barker story with Virginia Madsen. And then most recently, the 2021, that was partially written by Jordan Peele. I'm just saying with Dan Edmonds.
Hi there.
We talked a bit about kind of the idea of gothic horror and stuff like that. I think, kind of maybe to start out with, what would you say are like kind of what you see as like kind of possibly gothic elements to, kind of this story? Even though it's set in modern times, certainly, kind of 1992 set in Chicago and the more recent one in the more modern Chicago stuff.
I'll be honest, for me, the thing that really makes something, gives it that gothic kind of horror feel is something where there's another sort of element of sort of emotion or philosophy or something else that plays a part in the story. You can look at Dracula is, as we kind of talked about, has a sort of element of sexuality in it. Frankenstein has a kind of philosophical element of, man's progress through, with science, it's like this. And I kind of think when there is a kind of quite sort of human story or element to the story that isn't necessarily based around horror as part of it, that really makes it sort of something that really feels sort of a classic gothic horror. I mean, I would say the original Candyman kind of does fit in that mold for me anyway.
Definitely. Yeah, I think it's kind of that romantic, aspect of it is very much, just something that we would see, just as much in, like in future versions, we'll talk about, some of the stories by the Bronte sisters, or Jane Austen is another one that like kind of, has these kind of very much, romantic kind of ideas that, and it's not necessarily the setting that needs to kind of, be there, but it's certainly, I think, builds to the kind of romantic atmosphere or stuff like that.
Yeah, just gives it that depth, really, that isn't in Halloween, say.
Well, it's also very much not the case with like just going to the 1992 version and stuff, because Cabrini Green, back in that day, was far from it. I can speak from also having gone to school in Southside Chicago, where there were similar project homes, because this is like on the north side. You just basically felt like you're more in a war zone stuff. So it's very much not, like kind of the classic gothic, castle stuff like that. But however, there's still something about it that I think, in this case, it's probably because of the fact that like there's a connection with, Candyman and the this legend and stuff like that we hear, as the story goes on and stuff like that, how he was this, wrongfully tortured and killed by this mob and stuff like that. And so I think that kind of lends a little bit to even, kind of something more along the lines of we'll someday talk about in Frankenstein, stuff like that. There's something about that aspect too, that like different times monsters being chased by mobs is like kind of yet another classic, gothic horror element stuff.
Yeah, but I mean, of course, the real genius of the 92 version was that Bernard Rose, basically took what was originally a white protagonist, replaced him with a black protagonist in this, and it added this sort of tragic backstory of racial injustice that was, really sort of cleverly interjected into this otherwise also interesting Clive Barker sort of story.
I was going to say like that it's funny how like some of these properties of Clive Barker are taken from these short stories, and we see some of that with Stephen King as well. But another kind of favorite of mine is the Hellraiser was like another one that was just based on a short story and stuff.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about Candyman is it also, and I think a lot of Clive Barker stuff has this kind of slightly fetishist kind of element to it, of like pain mixed with pleasure. And like you've got that kind of similarity in Candyman in that, this is like a sort of ghostly butcher with a hook, but who's sort of infatuated with the the female protagonist in it. Yeah. So yeah, there's that interesting. That kind of makes a lot of his stuff feel quite timeless, really, because of that. ambiguity there.
Yeah, I mean, funny enough, like Virginia Madsen as the love interest and stuff. Her first major feature will be talking about her in Dune, and then after that, she pretty much has a lot of co-starring as love interest. It's like something that I think became her, as we talked about her shorthand and stuff.
Yeah, I forgot she was Princess Jessica in the original 84
yes.
June. Yeah, I enjoyed that as well. I thought she was good in both of these, to be honest. And the other interesting thing about this one is you've got Philip Glass doing the soundtrack for it, which gives it a very kind of sort of modern, but also kind of intricate and interesting soundtrack all the way through. And what was interesting was they never sort of interjected any sort of rap or any kind of like contemporary urban stuff into the soundtrack at all, which was
very little.
An interesting choice, because it's very rare that sort of happens. So gives it a very I would say there's something about the cinematography as well in this, and the way some of the scenes are put together that gives it a very kind of almost surreal, dreamlike quality, which I really thought was interesting. I always find that stuff that has a slightly off-kilter, surreal nature tends to stick in my mind a lot longer than a sort of by-the-numbers horror movie.
Yeah, I thought it was particularly interesting, the overhead shots as an intro and stuff like that. It really, kind of grounds things in Chicago and stuff. You get a sense of, the city. I don't know exactly which exact road that they were using, something like that, but it definitely looked very familiar. Because if it wasn't a Dan Ryan, it certainly ran very much like kind of how the Dan Ryan runs, which is, pretty much through this, the heart of the city and stuff like that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's very interestingly shot. Sounds interesting, and I think you've got some good performances in there as well. Tony Todd is great as Candyman.
Yeah, who we saw from Night of the Living Dead.
Of course, yeah. I mean, he's brilliant in this as well. Actually, really gives it. I mean, we'll get into that later, but it's certainly when he appears right at the end of the remake that you realize how good he was as Candyman compared to the guy they had. Anyway, I'll save my criticism for that. I mean, I think this whole concept, though, Candyman, is really interesting in this idea of repeating a name, especially into a mirror, because this seems to stem from sort of Bloody Mary, which was, her name would be used to invoke sort of love or somehow kind of death in a ritual where you'd end up repeating her name. And again, I think it was into a mirror in that as well. Oh no, you would look into the mirror and you'd see like your future husband's face or something like that was the idea with it. I think that was and just uses of mirrors are just so clever in any kind of horror movie, because it's an everyday object. We're constantly looking in mirrors, and the idea of something creeping up behind you is always in a bathroom or some sort of confined private place, sort of really heightens that idea.
Mirrors are definitely like one of those kind of classic horror elements. I mean, certainly quite a few movies have it. We of course talked about it with Dracula and stuff. And then other times, it's probably one of those tropes, right? That's often used, like where person's looking, doesn't see anything, and then they flip the mirror, and then there's something appears.
There's something there, yeah. I mean, it's it plays with this sort of very fundamental idea that this we kind of have such a sort of weird abstracted view of ourselves most of the time in our own head, and seeing an actual visual representation that perfectly copies us is always sort of slightly unnerving in a way. That's why dogs always kind of like bark at their own reflections and things like this, because it's no, it was very, very interesting and effectively used. And of course there's also the repetition of the name is such a great device to have in a horror movie, because the tension builds when someone starts saying the name more than like a couple of times. You're like, oh, are they going to do 5? Are they going to do 5? So it's it's just a fantastic mechanism for a horror movie.
And I could tell you, just even from like before we were talking, kind of doing the research a bit, that like just the number of podcasts that talk about Candyman, they all kind of refer to it, and they kind of all say like, okay, say it with us, and like that kind of number. Yeah.
I wouldn't dare say it 5 times into a mirror. No chance. I also think it was really clever the way, the fact that he is called Candyman and there's some kind of connection. And then, they're taking something very innocuous and something that appeals to children, which kind of heightens the threat level as well, because you kind of get this feeling that children might, be threatened by him just in his nature of what he is, essentially.
It's I know the story and stuff like that of the fact that, he's covered in, honey and tortured, stuff like that. But even then, that it's such a strange name to call him, because like you said, the just even the name Candyman, the association I have is from the Willy Wonka song and stuff. So to suddenly have it be this kind of tortured soul, something like that, it's like really it just an even more striking kind of like if we want to say mirrors of a mirror effect of like of a dark mirror, I guess, of that name and stuff.
Yeah, and it's weird though, because you almost feel like this whole bit of candy with razor blades in it was almost kind of like thrown in just to kind of justify the name. I almost feel like Clive Barker thought, "Ooh, Candyman's a cool name," and then he just said, "Oh yeah, but because of the sweets with the razor blades," which that's that's sort of, I'm just guessing there, but it seems that. But I suppose I mean, what's really sort of interesting for me with this was the this whole idea of this horrible sort of injustice from an interracial relationship that he is kind of enacting his revenge on, not necessarily on the particular people involved, which is what you see sometimes in kind of a horror slasher sort of movie, but it's more this idea that what happened to him is not forgotten. That's the kind of the underlying message of the first one, that he is kind of searching for this immortality through myth of what's happened to him and how he sort of enacts his revenge. And what's interesting is that you've got Helen Lyle's character as someone who's also in her own sort of way, as a creative person trying to write this book, also looking for sort of creative immortality through her story. And this idea that she's kind of this slightly kind of invasive force in this neighborhood where she's just sort of like going around interfering with people's lives, desperate to find this story. It kind of has this slightly exploitative kind of quality to it, in that she's there trying to sort of make her greatness out of other people's sort of bad luck or bad circumstances, essentially. And
certainly it's no kind of what's called accident that the the man himself, like kind of Candyman, stuff like that, he was an artist that basically because he dabbled with the wrong patron's daughter and stuff like that, was kind of basically hunted down and stuff. And we'll certainly see more of the artist kind of connection in the remake and stuff. But yeah, I mean, Robertal was basically this artist that then they cut off, and that's the hand that was cut off. Is kind of drawing hand and stuff too.
Yeah, and sort of defiled, and I mean sort of in a way it's sort of very blunt way of destroying his artwork in a way. It's an interesting sort of way of doing that. And likewise you kind of got like I said, she's sort of searching for her own story and her own immortality, and it's almost like you get the feeling she gets in over her head, and the Candyman kind of surreally twists this on its head. It's like, oh, you wanted to be famous, how about I make you famous for just killing people instead, which is a really cool twist on it, I think. And not unlike this idea of the monster in the movie making the protagonist seem like the person who's enacting these murders is something we've seen in the Invisible Man as well.
That's true.
In the remake as well, same sort of thing where, and this idea that, I've seen this sort of theme in other horror movies where the framing of the protagonist is there somehow as a kind of a love interest almost with the monster or the killer, in this idea that, well, if you've done the same kind of deeds as I have, that will somehow bring us together because you'll understand me more. Is the kind of theme a lot of the time in those sort of stories. And you kind of, it's weird. It's fairly ambiguous in this, in that he wants her to sort of be immortal with him, but you don't get the impression that he's that bothered about her understanding him. All this seems like this is kind of part and parcel with getting involved with the Candyman, essentially.
I mean, I always thought that like they were kind of hinting at this idea that, you know, I feel like some other movies are more, you know, kind of blatant about it, but like it seemed like they were hinting at that, like she is this kind of reincarnation of that daughter and stuff like that. And, you know, like it's troubling, of course, like, you know, because of the, you know, thing we talked about before with King Kong and this, you know, trope of, you know, kind of the black man, you know, kind of chasing, you know, white women kind of things like that. And I think that's, you know, one of the criticisms that people tend to have. But I think also it's more of a, you know, obsession, you know, kind of that supposedly transcends time and all that. That I feel like that's something that like we've seen before in some other horror movies. That this one, I feel like I'm kind of glad that they didn't make it so, you know, obvious, because certainly in some other movies they like kind of make, you know, they show the daughter, right, and they would show how the daughter is just like this, you know, kind of gothic version of, you know, kind of the modern, you know, character stuff.
Yeah, this has a much more subtle way of doing it. You almost feel, I sort of feel it's the opposite. I feel like she's the one kind of pursuing him and his legend in a way, and kind of falls into the role that, you know, was somehow kind of there in history, rather than her being a reincarnation. They do it in quite an interesting and subtle way, I think, in this one anyway.
And it's interesting how, on one hand, you know, like you said, that like Candyman seems to obsess with making her like kind of, you know, part of, you know, kind of their immortality, the legend, and all that kind of stuff. But meanwhile, like he's doing it through basically gaslighting her. That like he's, you know, like making her seem crazy, and how, you know, like she's the one that's kind of, you know, major spoiler, stuck with the bloody knife and stuff, and she gets caught, and then like, you know, locked up, and what's called, you know, kind of has to try to convince everyone that like, no, I'm not crazy and stuff.
Yeah, and it's odd that you have this sort of thing of him. I mean, whilst all this is going on, you know, his main gaslighting effort is kidnapping this child.
Oh, right.
And she is kind of initially the person blamed for this, but this is this kind of redemptive arc for her where she ends up saving the baby at the end.
Yeah, again, major spoiler.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, major spoiler. Sorry.
No worries.
But it makes you, you know, that in a way that almost feels like a kind of a sideline from this idea of the kind of the weird romantic kind of relationship that's going on. Because in a way he's got a kind of blackmailer to get her to sort of do what he wants and get her into the sort of the fire, and or get her into the positions where she's sort of being made the suspect of all these murders and things like this. So it's strange the way it's kind of, you know, there's this weird sort of manipulation.
And that's actually another criticism, is that you know, that basically it's once again the white, you know, kind of character that has to save the day and stuff like that. You know, again, like there's different folks who, like, you know, are very critical of these elements and stuff, of, you know, like kind of that that in some ways I get, you know, in all fairness, they are kind of tropes in horror movies and stuff. I mean, it's not, you know, like kind of what's called unfamiliar for us to see that, you know, like kind of the minorities are typically the ones that, like, if we see them as part of this party, they're the ones who are going to get killed off and stuff. I mean, that's like, again, another classic, you know, horror movie trope and everything. But you know, it is what it is.
No, but I mean, by the same time, it did some pretty interesting things. I mean, I think Candyman as a character is quite interesting. He's quite sort of weirdly charismatic, quite sort of mysterious, and he's a monster that you feel sorry for, which is not that usual in a kind of a any kind of horror movie, which is interesting. And I mean, they also sort of do other things that many other movies didn't do at the time, and that they made a sort of a class divide in that, you know, her middle class black friend, you know, gets killed off and isn't part of that sort of community, or is dealt, or, you know, they show her being just as uneasy in the project as other, you know, as more so than she is. You know, that, I mean, it may not seem like much these days, but that was quite a departure for Hollywood back then. They weren't that subtle often.
And she was a, you know, more or less equal too. She was a peer that like was co-writing with her, and she was in the graduate program as well. And that's, I think, I agree, like, because typically minorities were shown as either, you know, gangsters or some other kind of, you know, role like that stuff. So that was to kind of show her more of the Cosby, you know, post Cosby generation role stuff was I think, probably, you know, at least more current, if not, you know, kind of you know, a little bit more advanced for the time. So
I mean, also you had, you know, they did quite an interesting way of portraying the Cabrini Green, and that you had you know, they made it very obvious that the people living there were just as isolated from each other as they were from the sort of the rest of the world, and this sort of fear of them, and this sort of sense of abandonment was quite interesting. And that you had this kid Jake, who's just randomly you know, wandering around this fairly dangerous place. You know, has he got parents? Where are they? He's just kind of, you know, just, so there's some sort of quite interesting ways they portray that. And Virginia Madsen, you know, Helen Lyle is just sort of marching on in and trying to, you know, investigate any kind of weird holes in buildings that will get her closer to this thing. So it's there's a few sort of bits there. I mean, you know, they obviously try and address this sort of theme of gentrification as well, and that you've got this area that's, you know, built up but isn't really working, even though there's been this effort to try and sort of make a sort of stable neighborhood. But this idea that there's you know, this violence that sort of pervades beyond this particular sort of current neighborhood and the neighborhoods before it, I think, you know, which is also, again, I guess what Candyman kind of represents.
That was a kind of relatively minor kind of element in the story that but it was like kind of fairly early on that like she kind of realizes about the that connection with like kind of looking in the mirror and stuff, that behind it was the fact that, like, you know, it was this other, you know, abandoned apartment and everything that, you know, like, in other words, where she was living that was like kind of, you know, gentrifying stuff was this condo that was previously slated to be used as one of the project homes and stuff, you know. So it was a minor way of like kind of pointing out how like there was different times this problem of like corruption that you know, like one of the reasons why the projects failed and stuff was like that the ones that like were you know, that the residents were, you know, kind of black and all that, they basically were abandoned and stuff like that, and they weren't maintained. And then certainly that's how we see like kind of the Cabrini Green that, you know, like it's really shown as like where, you know, there's like feces on the, you know, walls of the public bathrooms and stuff. And then meanwhile, the ones that like were deemed almost too valuable and stuff, they made condos that then, you know, like kind of here's, you know, Helen Lyle is living there with, you know, his her husband and stuff like that, who, oh, we should mention Xander Berkeley, you know, kind of, which is partially like one of the main catalysts of this is his cheating husband and stuff like that. He's best known from 24, and then more recently on The Walking Dead. Another kind of funny zombie connection was this again, another character without a spine, and that's almost like becomes his shorthand over time and stuff.
I mean, and he ends up with basically just like the younger version of her character. Which of course, I mean, I don't know, Virginia Madsen's pretty tasty in it. I don't know. It just seems a bit excessive, but anyway. Well,
I mean, spoiler, like he ends up being, you know, kind of dissatisfied with her and then like kind of missing her and stuff, and then that's kind of like, you know, yet another catalyst for like kind of where you know, like I guess we'll leave that out, but basically the finale is based on the fact that like, you know, in the end he's still not satisfied, you know, like, you know, having, you know, kind of this this young grad student that kind of is supposed to be this kind of replacement. And so really, I guess, you know, the mirror then is a reflection of the fact that like, you know, ultimately he is a spiny jellyfish, and that like that's the issue, not she wasn't the issue, like you know, as the wife and stuff like that. She was a, you know, let's face it, she was an awesome wife considering, you know, how, you know, kind of he was a,
well,
you know,
I mean, I think there's a bit of gender stuff going on there, a bit of sort of, because, you know, she's obviously a very sort of strong-willed and fearless woman. He's obviously kind of, he's sort of threatened by that, and he's this kind of more submissive student, younger girl for him to sort of control a little bit more. Maybe that's the kind of subtext there. But yeah. I also love the fact that, and this is a sort of random side note, but I love the fact that at their dinner, there's a slightly maniacal English guy explaining the entire legend for everyone, just in case you missed anything. You know, thank goodness there's an English person around to do this for us.
Yes.
But yeah, and I think, you know, really the only other thing I can really mention about this movie that was absolutely mind-blowing for me was the scene with, and again, we're talking spoilers here, but the bees with the kiss at the end, which is made yet more amazing by the fact that Virginia Madsen is allergic to bee stings.
I didn't know that.
They had to use some kind of special bees that had their stings removed or were bred to not have them. And I think Tony Todd had a mouth guard to stop the bees going down. I mean, it's a really incredible scene. I mean, that scene is almost more horrifying than most horror movies in total these days. It's just amazing.
No CGI. I mean, these are the days of practical effects, and it is amazing the stuff that, you know, kind of what these actors will go through and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, hats off to both Virginia Madsen and Tony Todd for that scene. That's amazing.
Definitely.
So yeah. And I'm trying to remember if they did as much. They didn't have quite as much bee-related action in the sequel. No. But yeah. Overall, though, I mean, yeah, I really think I think sort of Candyman in a way is a kind of a bit like he's another sort of Freddy or Jason of the late 80s, early 90s, and it's such a powerful kind of idea. This idea of tempting fate by saying a name into a mirror and summoning something. Just a very kind of classic kind of backstory as well. And it also, I think that's what's kind of clever. There's also an element with sort of Freddy that you kind of feel sorry for him, because ultimately he was kind of burned to death. I know he was pretty horrible, and that's why he got burnt. But you know, there's you know, still sort of two sides of it to make you feel somewhat you can identify with him a bit. So yeah.
Overall, I also feel like partially it lets us like the character a bit more too, like, you know, because Freddy, for all intents and purposes, he is, you know, as much as you know, he's not only monster but villain and stuff, we still really just find him kind of entertaining, and we like him. I mean, you know, he's this kind of, you know, just like what's called similar to Michael Myers in some ways, and also to you know, Jason Voorhees and stuff.
Yeah, in his own sort of way, I think, you know, Candyman's as iconic in a way. Was there any other bits you wanted to?
No, I think.
I mean, I guess I'm thinking, do they actually talk about the police very much and sort of police violence in the original, or with the Cabrini Green? I don't. I mean, they do kind of make reference to it in that I think, like, people are calling 911 and they go kind of the calls go unanswered.
Yeah,
but it's not. Yeah, obviously not like the follow-up.
Yeah,
in 2021. But yeah,
I guess maybe we should. That's a good segue into it. That you know, if anything, that's like one of the, you know, again, major spoiler. You know, like in the ending, right? We certainly see it as like kind of that they make that like the central point of what they're trying to drive at and stuff is the fact that, like, here we are in the post Black Lives Matter era and stuff, and certainly like it's I think first off, even though that like this is we're treating this as a remake and stuff, it's really, like you said, it's a sequel. It's really a follow-up to the original. In fact, if anything, what they did was they made the original story become the addition to the fable of Candyman, or like kind of how basically the legend kind of expanded with Helen and stuff being kind of like now part of the canon, I guess, if you will, of Candyman.
Yeah, full disclosure, I didn't actually know it was a sequel and not a remake. So,
but
it is a kind of a remake anyway, though, I suppose. But
yes, because they didn't call it Candyman 2 or anything like that. If anything, it's. I mean, until we kind of really get into it, it's you really don't know, like kind of how much of it, like because on top of everything else, it can really be treated as a standalone movie, because it's not as though you needed to watch the first one to really understand what's going on in this one.
No, I guess the clever element of this is the repetition of trauma and the repetition of the character being played by different people is actually kind of woven into the story. So it's quite clever in that extent. So it's kind of a remake and kind of a sequel at the same time. But yeah, I mean, I kind of felt this was about a few different things, really, because you had this very prominent element of police brutality, even with the fact that they use the say his name element, which is exactly what people have been using in the Black Lives Matter to talk about the victims.
Right.
Also, the other sort of, and of course they talk about gentrification, and they also talk about how Black people in the creative realms are either, and what sort of difficulties or how they sort of go about that, and how the world sort of sees them, or how the art world can see them, which is quite a lot to. I mean, I think that if I had a criticism, it would be that I think it tried to pack almost too much into this, and tried to pack it in a way in which it's people talking at you and telling you about it, rather than it kind of being shown. For me, actually, the most interesting bits were the idea of how creativity is sort of dealt with, and how sort of Black artists are dealt with in the art world. Because you have, I mean, what I really, you have this it starts off with, obviously we should point out that now we have our main character who is an artist, much like the original Candyman, who's sort of struggling to find his new pieces that he's going to put on display for his art deal. And you've got this very cynical art dealer who ironically in one sentence says, "Oh, I want the work of, the tomorrow work of Anthony." And then the next minute he's saying, "Yeah, dig into that history, dude," into a very kind of hypocritical kind of way of getting him to try and exploit some element of his heritage. So on one element, you've got this guy, this white dude, pushing him in that direction. Then at the same time, you've got this art critic who's sort of saying that, well, there's just sort of young Black artists going to a neighborhood, just finding a few stories, slapping together, and kind of accusing them of this oversimplification of the artwork, rather than and sort of discrediting them in that way.
And treating it as like, kind of that, I've seen it all before, and stuff like that.
Yeah. So what I thought was really, and what I thought was interesting was that on one hand, it kind of, I should point out as well, when he starts investigating Cabrini Green, his artwork is quite simple. It's just sort of depictions of violence. And ironically, the girlfriend is saying, well, there's not much room for viewer interpretation here. And I thought, ironically, that's kind of what would be the criticism I had of the movie as a whole, in that there wasn't really much room for viewer interpretation of the movie, because they kind of threw it at you quite sort of obviously. But as a sort of a general idea with this artwork, it both accuses people, or in particular Black artists, of potentially exploiting things for profit, I guess, or gain.
Yeah.
And but at the same time also proposes that you could also be pigeonholed by the art world for trying to do that. So regardless if you do actually aren't doing something really interesting, and you still might get dealt and, you know, treated like this. So I thought that was a really interesting juxtaposition they put around that, and that was really the most interesting element for me in this.
Almost like a damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's also this line later on where they sort of where they say, "Oh, they love what they make, but not us," which I thought was a really interesting insight. And there's this kind of, and it's almost the gentrification is almost like I felt it was kind of an addition to that in a way, because you have them pretty much explaining to you what gentrification is right at the beginning, but then the art gallery almost kind of underpins this by, you know, these quite well-to-do artists who are completely abstractly removed from the previous history of the area, sort of drinking their champagne and eating canapes, discussing this kind of theme. So that was a really kind of interesting way they kind of underpinned that.
I feel like that's a element of Gothic horror that's a little bit more implied, where you have this kind of cross worlds between the wealthy and, you know, kind of the commoners and stuff. You know, like you know, you see that a lot in like kind of the Jane Austen type stories and stuff. And it's just like, and that's part of the romantic notion of that, like you know, something that can break past, you know, the class structure stuff. I mean, certainly, I feel like that's something that, like, you know, you can certainly speak to it a lot more than I can, and stuff like that. That I think in this country, at least, you know, in theory, you know, you can kind of be anybody in this kind of this attitude stuff. The reality, of course, is very different, but we'll get more into that in a little bit.
Well, I should point out, I don't necessarily think of Jane Austen as Gothic horror.
But, interesting. Well, no. I guess I'm thinking more. Sorry, I should say that, like, I mean,
Mary Shelley, maybe.
More in terms of like Gothic, in terms of like the story elements, and more like kind of, you know, Gothic romance and stuff. And,
Okay. Yeah. I was going to say.
But certainly that's kind of what led to
Pride and Prejudice and Vampires, or whatever it was. Yeah, right. Yeah, it's funny. There's obviously somebody made that connection as well, clearly. But I think you're right. And this whole sort of abstract removal from what's actually going on, and how art sort of takes a step back and can quite sort of coldly look at things without really having any empathy or connection with what happened, is kind of what I feel they're accusing art in general of, because there's that scene, you know, where the art dealer his girlfriend gets killed after she, again, spoilers, after summoning Candyman, and there's this line, "Is this real?" And he's so removed that he can't actually tell,
and I think that's also like a telling statement of, like, kind of, you know, like, whether it's, you know, Gothic, you know, or otherwise stuff, that the wealthy, and we've talked about this before, like, a lot of times have this kind of distance from the day that, you know, because certainly, you know, when you have enough money, right, where you don't have to worry about where your next, you know, kind of paycheck is coming from, where, you know, like, kind of whether you're gonna, you know, be able to kind of feed your family, so something like that, you do become more distant from, like, kind of the things that, like, you know, us commoners have to worry about, like, kind of like taking care of, you know, bills, taking care of, like, things and stuff. And I think that's like a statement also, like, kind of that we can see in art, that, like, you know, when it's kind of very relevant, then it does show, like, kind of, you know, violence and you know, kind of the realities of life. But then, you know, the more abstract it gets, it seems like it's kind of the less connection it has with, like, you know, real life. And yet, like, in some ways, sometimes that's even more valued, right, by the wealthy and stuff, like some of the most abstract kind of art.
Yeah. Or likewise, they could value the ultra realistic stuff just because they are so inherently removed from it themselves, I guess. Yeah. I also thought, one other thing I thought was, I mean, this does tie in with the original, and I thought what was interesting is the way they kind of tied it in with Helen's story, in that she, in this one, her story is kind of rewritten by the community, and that she's the one who's guilty of kind of stealing the baby, and you know, she's very much sort of blamed. So it's making this point of, you know, depending on who's writing the story, and I'm sure this is often, you know, the various white people being accused of rewriting black people's history, but you know, we see that shoe on the other foot in this, in terms of Helen's story, and the fact that they suggest that, you know, they didn't bother about writing about anyone else. It was just her, because she was the only sort of white woman in that community while this was going on. So it was kind of interesting the way they did that. But there's also this, you know, as we mentioned, this kind of theme of police brutality in this one, where you've got this almost like the community under siege by these this sort of over the top police force, who are just there sort of basically kind of keeping everyone almost in a prison state, almost within this neighborhood.
Yeah, the term that came to mind for me while watching this was, you know, psycho-violence, you know, like where, you know, like what's called justice different times is often just revenge and just, you know, kind of what's called an eye for an eye kind of thing and stuff. And, you know, it's something that, like, certainly we've seen that, you know, kind of more recently, and kind of, you know, the Black Lives Matter and stuff. And then also, like, there's this kind of tragedy, right, that happens where, you know, the girlfriend slash, you know, kind of art director Bree, played by Teyonah Parris and stuff, she watches her dad, you know, kill himself, and then meanwhile, you know, like kind of, you know, she's watching this boyfriend, which, we should mention, the boyfriend Anthony is played by Yahya Abdul-Mateen from Watchmen and stuff. So and she's watching this boyfriend self-destruct, so it's kind of like, you know, again, this kind of repeating of violence. And I think it's something that, like, is seen, like, very much in, you know, kind of the community and stuff. And you know, where you grow up and you know, you're, you know, maybe your best friend kind of you know, is killed and stuff and everything, then you end up in a gang and you end up killing somebody else, you know, another gang member, and it just, again, like, kind of just this, you know, cycle of violence.
And I think that it's, you know, this idea that the Candyman has been several other people, and I thought it was kind of interesting the way they used the artwork as these, you know, he's manically painting these portraits to the previous Candymen, I guess, on his wall, and that was an interesting kind of, you know, slant to take on it. I kind of felt, I almost felt in a way that whole sort of element of artistic sort of process, and how that, you know, how trauma kind of can somehow be reflected in artwork, or what that relationship is like. You could have explored that in more detail, I think, in this. I mean, I hate to say it, but it does seem like the whole kind of police brutality thing felt a bit it felt like something that was a bit sort of tacked on at times in this one. And it was, you know, because ultimately it was sort of racial injustice in the original one that sort of got him killed, and, you know, by incorporating the police brutality, obviously trying to sort of make it more relevant, which it did. I mean, as I say, it all just became a bit too much of, you know, it's interesting for people like us to sit around and talk about these things, because there's lots of different ideas to sort of get thrown around. But I don't know that it really made I think the movie lost a bit of coherency because of that. But
I mean, what's called, I mean, overall, I felt like that they had a lot of great ideas, and they, you know, kind of, you know, were trying to, it seemed like they were trying to drive some of these, but then, yeah, definitely the fact that they tried to, you know, throw in so much, and they kind of went in different directions with it. I think then in the end, it kind of really, it just kind of just weakens, like, overall, like, you know, like at the end of it, you kind of walk away, you know, feeling like, you know, like, what was it, like, kind of, you know, like they were driving at and stuff, and, you know, like, you know, not that, you know, necessarily that you should have a, you know, like, kind of, you know, as we've seen with some remakes and stuff, like, kind of, you know, this obvious kind of, you know, like, you know, thing that they're driving at, this kind of message, if you will. But, you know, at the same time, definitely was a lack of like kind of some kind of coherency as like kind of things were wrapping up and stuff, and the police thing, like I said, did thing like they were trying to like use that as like kind of the okay, this is it and stuff, but I think it was like kind of at that point like almost little too late, I guess.
Yeah, well, I think also I didn't feel very sort of connected to the main character that much, Anthony. And it's interesting because, well, again, so not only have you got the retelling of Helen's story, we should also mention that he is connected in that he's the baby that was left in the fire.
Right.
Yeah, more spoilers. Yeah, but which was an interesting kind of connection, along with the original mother from, was it Vanessa Williams was playing?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
that was pretty cool. There was all sort of quite clever ways of tying it in. Likewise, visually, there was lots of really cool things, and you had the city sort of reflected almost in a sort of dreamlike clouds at the beginning. The shadow puppets to kind of tell.
I thought that was one of the most. Yeah, that was definitely one of the most powerful parts of the movie.
Yeah, one of the most effective things I thought as well.
Yeah.
And also, what I really enjoyed was this idea that there is this visual element of seeing Candyman appear behind you in the original, whereas Anthony, when he says it, he actually becomes the Candyman in the mirror, which was kind of an interesting twist on it.
Yeah,
and this idea of almost like elements of The Fly, in that he's bitten by this bee, and his artistic arm is being transformed into whatever the Candyman wants him to kind of portray, and he actually sees himself turning into this kind of monster in a way.
Yeah,
and I thought it was going to be a much more similar plot beat when the art critic died, because I was expecting that to almost be like the psychologist's role in the original, because there's this point in the original where the psychiatrist is this person who plays a pivotal part, where he's assessing the mental state of Helen, and she, from that point forward, she is sort of implicated unquestionably in these murders.
Oh, right.
And in this one, I was thinking they might do something in that, rather than the mental state, she's criticizing his creative state at that point in time. And what that was another interesting thing, is that when actual real violence was involved with his artwork, it suddenly became really interesting and more relevant.
Right.
So again, it sort of like highlights this hypocritical kind of nature of artwork. If you can spin an interesting enough story around a piece of art, then it all of a sudden becomes more interesting and credible, which I think is very true. You can definitely, if you can find an interesting enough interpretation for something, then you can definitely sell it to people more.
But one thing though, like with what you just said, I think, wasn't it that after the art critic died, that then Anthony did become like the prime suspect? I thought,
well, maybe it was then, yeah.
So I'm wondering if that was something that they did mirror from the original. So,
which in itself
is interesting. I didn't think about that though, but I think when you pointed it that way, I was kind of like, oh, maybe that was something that they did, kind of intentionally do as a mirror effect, if you will.
Yeah, and I think again, this is this kind of on a meta level, that's quite a sort of clever intellectual thing, because it's by mirroring elements of the original, you're also kind of like playing into part of what the mythology of the original character, which is very clever.
Yeah.
Again, though, clever, but does it make a really entertaining horror movie? Is the question. But so I mean, that's the thing, is like you can't really fault them for not having the ideas and putting a lot of stuff into it. It was very clever in that respect. But yeah.
And just even like kind of the killing itself, though, I thought like it was like, I think overall, like you're saying, there was a lot of things that were really done well, and I feel like the way that some of the things are shot were, because like just even the art critic, the way they showed her being killed and stuff wasn't like kind of the typical kind of overt shot. It was like us watching it from this, almost like a rear window effect stuff. So we were like, we had this distance, and I feel like that was more powerful, because like it felt like something that like, if you were like just kind of just happened to be going by the building, you kind of like were wondering like, did I really just see that and stuff? And I thought that that was pretty a powerful, and again, another powerful kind of image and stuff.
Yeah, and it visually sort of echoes what they're trying to say earlier, in that the art, in this case, whereas the artist or the critic is removed from the subject and abstracted from it, in this we're kind of removed and abstracted from the real violence that's enacted on the critic. It's kind of quite a clever visual kind of pun there.
That's true.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's, as I say, there was a lot of very clever stuff in it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
I think that's kind of no small part to why the director, who I should mention, apparently she's the first blockbuster, if you will, kind of director that so she's got definitely a lot of kind of well earned. Nia da Costa is kind of apparently she's getting a lot of praise for it and stuff, and I think it is well earned in that respect.
Yeah, and she's directing Marvel loves to scoop up sort of
new
rising directors, and she's doing the new The Marvels, which is the new Captain Marvel, Miss Marvel movie. Yeah, well, we'll see how she does with that. I mean, I think this idea though of mirroring is something that seems to sort of show up in Jordan Peele's work quite a lot as well. The whole, I haven't watched Us, but I gather from what I have seen, there's a very strong theme in it. It does make you wonder why there is this sort of fascination that he has with doppelgangers and mirror images and things like this. It's very intriguing. The other thing that I thought was really interesting was this idea that when he has pretty much become one thing I didn't think was interesting was the fact that the laundromat guy all of a sudden is the evil person who's trying to turn him into Candyman. That felt like a weird kind of crowbarred in kind of element to the story, and didn't really, I don't know, it didn't really resonate very well with me. I felt like there was an element where the movie was following a similar kind of surreal, dreamlike quality, like the original, and then that came in, and it all of a sudden became aha, there's a twist, and I'm the bad guy, the moustache twirling, and I thought, you've kind of lost some of the more interesting kind of abstract element behind the story there a little bit. But what I did think was cool was the way that when he actually pretty much kind of does fully transform, he sees as a premonition where he's going to die, and sees the gunshots that eventually kill him, but still walks towards them, which I thought was a really interesting element. Kind of.
I was going to mention that the laundromat guy himself, Billy Burke, is played by Colman Domingo, who actually I actually really like him in Fear the Walking Dead. So I guess it's funny how some of the different folks have this horror movie or horror kind of pedigree and stuff like that. It's almost like where it's like if you have some of these in your background stuff, then you're qualified to be in some of these kind of more high profile horror movies and stuff.
Yeah. One thing we haven't talked about as well is the comedic elements as well, in that you kind of have. I think what was interesting, and I don't know if it was more of a sort of a postmodern way of looking at the idea of repeating the name, but I don't know if you noticed, but in the original, repeating the name is used as a device for tension. In this, it's almost used as a device for comedic effect, in that there's people sort of making fun of this idea and doing it as a joke. Until, of course, we get the all-white sort of teen girls who will get butchered in the bathroom, which I thought was kind of interesting. I mean, nice to see it, the other way around, in that.
And I think that's a funny kind of spin on the idea that we kind of hear it in a couple other parts where like with the black characters, I'm not gonna say it and stuff like that. And in fact, there's a little black girl in the stall, right? And she happens to have a Black Lives Matter button and everything. And she's the one that kind of not only doesn't say it, but then she's the witness to the horror. And I feel like it's this kind of this idea that different times, again, it's probably the thing that the violence that happens the cycle of violence we talked about, a lot of times, it's kind of treated as a joke, to some different, kind of folks in the white community, that like, oh, that kind of, it is all silly and all that kind of stuff. And, like White Lives Matter also was like a lot of ways that it's downplayed and everything. And then again, it's how they're less in touch with the realities. They're the ones who, we've talked before about redlining and kind of the things that affect very much the African American community are in fact, the realities. And meanwhile, you haven't had to worry about these things because you've had a very privileged life. You had the VA, what's called guarantee for your loan and stuff like that. You weren't, kind of segregated into these neighborhoods. You didn't have to, be basically shuffled into these project homes and stuff.
Yeah, no, it was an interesting twist, definitely, in that scene, no doubt. Yeah. Again, there was a lot in this movie. It's almost like you need to watch it a few times to pick up everything in it.
I felt like in the end, for how they may have felt short in a lot of ways in their ambition and stuff, I feel like they did achieve a lot. I think partially because of how a lot of things were well crafted and everything. It's a really, let's face it, it's a really tight movie. It's kind of the more standard 90 minutes stuff versus the original and everything. So I think they were trying to really compress things and stuff. And I think to the suffering of the fact that like a lot of times then they were trying to do so much in so little.
Yeah. As I say, it's definitely an interesting movie, no doubt about it. A lot of interesting stuff going on in there.
Well, very, very watchable. I think time will tell whether how rewatchable it is and stuff. I think.
Yes, the true test of any movie has been determined. So
Yep.
Did you? I mean, it's difficult to sort of say. Do you like the original or the remake, or if it was even a remake?
Yeah, I feel like in some ways they're almost like two different movies. Certainly they. Of course, whether we treat it as a remake or we treat it as a sequel and stuff, they definitely are like kind of, mirror images of each other and stuff. I feel like, of course, the 2021 is a lot more relevant to what's happening now. And I feel like the other part of it is the fact that like it's made with a different voice. I mean, certainly having the original made by, a white filmmaker kind of gives it, makes it what it is and stuff. It has a lot of awareness. It has a lot of, definitely they clearly made a lot of effort to kind of be more aware of kind of, what was happening in Chicago and all that. But I think maybe in some ways that's a statement itself that like, you can do your research. You can kind of, as we see with, kind of Helen Lyle and all that. But in the end, like, you are still an outsider in a lot of ways. You are visiting. And I think, like kind of, what the 2021 version shows is that like, okay, kind of this is what happens when you have somebody who, grew up with it, or, maybe not, directly stuff, but like, it seems like there was more, not just self-awareness, but just the fact that they, kind of, it was more closer to home, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, for me, both really interesting movies. I would give the nod to the original just because it's slightly scarier. But I would say for its sort of interesting ideas and complexity, I like the second one quite a lot as well. I should also point out the soundtrack is really interesting for the remake as well. I was very impressed with the soundtrack. It's really cool. A lot to like in both, really.
What stood out for the soundtrack for you?
I think it was just the. It's hard to say because it's quite an abstract soundtrack as well. I think it was just the. It created some of the tension that was perhaps otherwise lacking. I think it was pretty good at creating tension. There was this very kind of atonal, slightly weird sort of rhythmic stuff going on when he's kind of unearthing the story. That really kind of stuck out to me.
Okay.
Yeah. And the rest of it, I was probably too involved in the movie to notice it after that. That was probably early on.
Right.
But it was really cool the way it was done.
Awesome.
So I guess we're back to, well, depending on when we show this, of course, we're doing our part 2 of our Dracula series. following on from this.
Yeah, with Frank Langella, and the more recent one with Francis Ford Coppola, and of course Gary Oldman. So yeah, definitely look forward to talking about those. So I think after that we may continue the monster, the verse, I guess, with the other Universal, the Mummy and Wolfman, as other kind of movies we'll be discussing.
Is Frankenstein in there as well? Is
he yes,
Universal property?
Of course,
yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
Oh, there you go, yeah.
So definitely that'll be our lead into October, the Hollywood Halloween season and stuff. So
yeah, sounds good.
Awesome. Once again, I'm John Chang, Dan Edmonds, and we will see you at the movies.